Chapter 35, The Lieutenant's Office. "What's happening?" Lieutenant Monty Watkins asked as Lieutenant Edward Pierce bolted past him in the center hallway toward East Yard. "Deuces," Pierce yelled, and Watkins immediately fell in behind him. Whenever someone dialed the numbers 222 on an internal telephone, an alarm sounded in the control center. Triple deuces was only supposed to be dialed when an officer was in trouble. Every staff member was supposed to run to the phone that had been used to sound the alarm. The only guards exempted were those at posts considered too critical to be abandoned. As the two lieutenants exited from the main penitentiary and entered the East Yard, they were joined by Lieutenant Tracy Johns. Someone in the prison industries building had sounded the alarm at 10:50 a.m., and as the three men bolted toward the building, they ran into a wave of convicts who had just been released from their jobs in the textile shop for lunch. Johns ordered the men to clear a path, and as they did, he yelled to the guards stationed at the metal detector in the East Yard, "Hold him up here." An immediate groan rose from the inmates as they realized they were going to have to wait in the yard until the emergency was resolved. They were ordered to stop at the metal detector, which was located halfway between the Industries building and the main penitentiary. Most sat on the sidewalk in grass, a few pulled out smokes. Shortly after the three lieutenants disappeared into the Industries building, another 30 employees came running into the yard in response to the alarm. It is about 50 yards from the main penitentiary to Prison Industries, and the staff members had to pass the waiting inmates to get there. "Here comes the cavalry," one inmate cracked. "Please, God, oh, God, please let there be a body this time," another convict said. The guard at the metal detector, who was not supposed to leave his post when the alarm sounded, acted as if he had heard the wisecracks. About 1 minute later, a group of about 20 more staff members came into the yard, but they were moving much more slowly. These were stragglers. Many were older men. Some were fat and simply couldn't keep up with the first group. But there were a few guards in this group who were young and in good condition. Some worked in remote areas of the prison and were late because they had come from far away. But one or two were always among the last to respond. "Cowards," one of the inmates said. "Better hurry," said another sarcastically. "Gonna miss the fun." "Run, fat boys, run," heckled a third. Once this group disappeared, there was nothing for the inmates to do but continue waiting. As always, the whites had grouped themselves away from the blacks. Earl Coleman Bay, a burly black convicted murderer, drug dealer, and head of the DC Blacks gang, sat on the grass near the detector. "If you ever wanted some hostages," he said, "all you gotta do is sound deuces. These dummies will run right to you." "Shit, Earl," another inmate volunteered. "Sound them deuces 3 or 4 times, and these fat motherfuckers will be running around so much they'll all be dead of heart attacks." The group surrounding Coleman Bay laughed. The whites didn't react. Every inmate was expected to work, unless he had a medical disability. The convicts waiting near the detector were among the 600 inmates at the hot house who had jobs in Prison Industries. They earned an average of $250 per month, working 8 hours a day at the print shop, textile shop, or furniture plant. They could earn incentive pay too, and vacation days, normally spent lounging around their cells. Any inmate who didn't want to work in Unicor was assigned a job somewhere else in the prison. At best, he earned $75 a month, painting the cell blocks, waxing and buffing floors, helping in the kitchen, or doing other odd jobs. Most of these men only worked about 4 hours a day, and about 1/3 of them were assigned to what the convicts called make work, jobs created just to give them something to do. The Industries building at the hot house was a 4-story brick structure with 3 wings. The print shop was on the lower floors of the first wing. Textile work was done on the upper floors, and the furniture factory was in the other 2 wings, together with the storage area and administrative offices. Unlike jobs in the outside world, work assignments at Unicor were often based on the length of an inmate's sentence rather than his educational background or skills. Men serving several life sentences with little chance of parole were taught the most complicated tasks and were often trained as equipment repairmen. Short-termers were given easily learned routine work. It was not unusual for older convicts who had been in Leavenworth for years, to know more about the various presses, sewing machines, and assembly line operations that the associate warden for industries who served on the warden executive staff. None of the products made by convicts at Leavenworth could be sold to the public. That was one of the conditions Congress placed on the Bureau when Unicor was created. The politicians wanted to make certain that convicts wouldn't take jobs away from the local community or compete with private industry. Inmates in the textile plant sewed together t-shirts for the Army and canvas bags for the Postal Service. The print shop made nearly all the forms and stationery used by the Bureau. Chairs, desks, and bookcases made by the furniture factory went to the cadet quarters at West Point or to other military installations. 70 staff members worked at Unicor. Many of them had started out as guards, but had switched because they could earn better pay at Unicor and work regular hours. The fact that Unicor supervisors made more money and worked better hours irked most guards, and some didn't associate with them. But what really caused tension between the guards and the supervisors was the atmosphere in prison industries. It was not uncommon for inmates to call their supervisors by their first names or join them for coffee breaks. No self-respecting guard ever allowed an inmate to get friendly. The reason such familiarity was tolerated in Unicor was because its staff needed the inmates' cooperation in order to meet production deadlines. Whenever inmates felt they were being abused by a manager, they slowed down. Technically, the Unicor employees were responsible for guarding the inmates as well as supervising them. But there was little need for tight security inside the building, even though many of the inmates worked with tools that could easily have been used as weapons. This was because the inmates genuinely wanted to earn money for themselves or their families, and they didn't want to do anything on the job that might shut down the program or get them fired. The Bureau had closed Unicor operations in the past when it felt the inmates were too rebellious or when there were repeated problems in a factory. In appearance, the three plants at the hothouse looked no different from any print, textile, or furniture manufacturing operation outside the walls, but there were subtle reminders of where they were located. We were sewing together t-shirts, an inmate recalled, and I had just about filled my basket. I was going to turn it in to my boss. We were way behind, so we were getting a bonus for every basket we did on our normal quota. Anyway, I got up to take a piss, and when I came back, my basket is empty. As soon as I turned my back, these shitheads I work with stole every one of my t-shirts for their baskets. The triple deuces alarm that had brought Lieutenant Pierce, Watkins, and Johns running into the building to help rescue a staff member was another reminder. But when these men burst into the textile shop, they didn't find an emergency. The room was empty except for rows of industrial sewing machines and yards of canvas ready to be cut into mail bags. Obviously, one of the convicts now sitting outside the building by the metal detector had sneaked into the floor supervisor's office and dialed the alarm moments before he and other men had been released to go to lunch. It was impossible to guess why. It was against the rules for inmates to use any telephone without permission, except for the payphones in the cell houses. The inmate might have been playing a prank, responding to another inmate's dare, or he might have had some other reason. Perhaps a friend of his had wanted to move some drugs or hooch into one of the cell houses and had asked the inmate to set off the alarm in the industries building to distract the guards. The three lieutenants could only guess. They returned to the prison yard, and Johns told the guard manning the metal detector to let the inmates proceed to lunch in the mess hall. As Johns watched them file through the detector, another call came through on his radio. An inmate had cut himself with a knife in the kitchen and was hurrying out into the yard on his way to the prison hospital. Johns was told to make certain that the wound was an accident. The bleeding inmate had run through the center hall and left a trail of red drops on the white tile floor. Two women employees who worked in the administration building were on their way to lunch at the officers' mess when they noticed the blood. An inmate coming down the hall in the opposite direction had seen it too, and he bent down, touched his index finger to one of the spots, and swirled it into a larger circle on the floor. He glanced at the two approaching women and stood up so that he was facing them. He raised his blood-smudged index finger, making an obscene gesture, and then slowly licked the blood from it with his tongue. Grimacing, the two women hurried past him. The inmate laughed and continued his walk down the center hall.